St. Paul's Cathedral stood like a monument to God's silence, perfect, towering, and always watching. In 1887, London called it the soul of its city, a spine of sacred stone in a time when faith still ruled the minds of men. Its bells tolled with certainty, marking hours and lives, births and funerals, grace and grief alike. But that summer the bells began to skip, not all of them, just one. The final Mass bell, the low, solemn chime that marked the end of a priest's last service before his journey elsewhere, fell silent. At first no one noticed, or rather, they noticed, but said nothing. In the church it was often safer to observe than to question. It began with Father Benedict. He was scheduled to lead the morning prayers on June 2nd, a Thursday. He never arrived. No sermon, no explanation, no farewell. His cassock still hung neatly in his quarters, collar pressed, shoes aligned beneath the hearth as if waiting for him to slip back into them. On his desk, a prayer book lay open to a psalm about silence. The rectory staff assumed illness, but no doctor was summoned. His absence was absorbed, digested, and never spoken of again. 3 days later, the name beneath the pulpit schedule had changed. Father Willoughby took his place. Then it happened again, and again. One after another, 15 priests failed to appear for their final masses across the next 5 months. There were no parish notices, no memorials, no processions. The laity whispered but were given nothing. Inside the cathedral's rectory, the air turned thick with a quiet that felt deliberate, not accidental. Sermons grew shorter. Confessions became hurried, reluctant. There was an odd smell sometimes. Sweet, metallic, and warm, but it passed like incense. No one dared to name it. The higher clergy dismissed concerns. Priests were often moved unexpectedly, they said. Some fell into retreat, others transferred to foreign missions. The church had its ways and its reasons and no obligation to explain. But within the stone corridors of the cathedral, something began to shift. A kind of psychological mildew set in. The young priests kept their doors locked. Candles were left burning through the night. Some began skipping meals. One was seen reciting scripture backward under his breath, claiming it warded off the dark between the echoes. That same man was reassigned to Bristol within the week, and the cathedral forgot his name. There were no investigations, no letters sent to families. Records were redacted or rewritten. What remained behind were inconsistencies, small and deliberate. Journal entries with torn pages, robes left neatly folded on beds too cold to have been slept in. Rosaries found snapped and burned inside empty confessionals. The church archivist, a quiet deacon named Reeve, once noted a chilling fact before his own resignation. All 15 missing priests had marked the same final passage in their service books. A verse referencing the sound of bells heard in dreams. After that, even the archivist was never seen again. By October, the final Mass bell had not rung in over a month. It sat in its housing above the south transept, coated in soot and pigeon droppings, its clapper frozen like a tongue mid-prayer. Those who climbed the tower said the rope had been cut, not frayed, severed. No replacement was ever ordered. In the cold of winter, the silence that hung above St. Paul's was no longer passive. It was expectant, as though the cathedral itself had agreed to hold its breath. And within that breathless pause, a new figure quietly entered the city's spiritual circle. His name was Father Llewellyn Ashcroft, but he never called himself that. He preferred simply listener, and he had been listening for a very long time. Father Thomas Benedict had always been considered one of the gentler clergy. In his mid-40s, his presence was soft-spoken, his sermons cautious, and his eyes tired but kind. He had no enemies, no ambitions, and no past worth scandal. But in the final weeks before his disappearance, something in him had begun to erode quietly. Not like a man unraveling from stress, but like a man whose reflection had started whispering back. He began double-locking the door to his quarters even during daylight. He refused to meet alone with parishioners and became nervous around candles, often insisting they be extinguished after sundown. The altar boys noted how he now flinched when the cathedral bells rang, especially the final one, the deep toll that usually brought him peace. That sound, he said one night to the housekeeper, was beginning to carry something else. It didn't ring anymore, he whispered. It breathed. The whispers started after a night of confession. He'd emerged pale and trembling, claiming he heard someone else whispering alongside the penitent. A second voice, dry and layered like parchment catching fire. From then on, Father Benedict began writing strange notations in the margins of his sermons. Not prayers, not thoughts. They were sequences of numbers, compass bearings, and phrases like "walk at the tone" and "left hand closed, right hand bleeds." He tore up many of them, but left enough behind to suggest a pattern. Something or someone had begun speaking to him in his sleep. And whatever it was, it claimed to be rewriting his sermons. His tone in Mass grew sharper. Some said he trembled as he read, as if each word stung as it left his mouth. A week before he vanished, Father Benedict approached the cathedral archivist and requested access to blueprints from the early 1700s. Not of the church above, but of the tunnels and burial rooms said to lie beneath the nave. He claimed it was research for a future sermon on spiritual descent. The archivist, skeptical but obedient, gave him limited access. That night, Benedict sat in the library for over 6 hours, running his fingers across the pages instead of reading them, whispering verses under his breath in a cadence no one could place. When asked what he was studying, he simply said, "There's a door they sealed, and it's whispering now." He was last seen on June 1st, just after complying. The weather was warm. His room was left in perfect order. The fireplace still crackled. His robe was neatly draped over the back of a chair, and his shoes sat beside the hearth, soles unscuffed, heels dry. No carriage was heard. No one saw him pass through the gate. The cathedral porter confirmed no keys had been checked out. The only strange detail, if anyone had dared to call it that, was the faint scent of melted beeswax in the hallway, though no candles had been lit. What the church never disclosed was the final entry found in a hidden compartment of Father Benedict's desk. It was written in shaking, rushed ink, as if transcribed mid-panic. It read, "There is a tone only the damned can hear. It plays at dawn under the floor, and it knows my name. The door isn't locked, it's listening. I've stopped praying because it's begun answering." That note was filed under delirium. The church's official stance was exhaustion. They claimed Benedict had taken a temporary leave for health, a quiet transfer to a monastery in northern Wales, they said. But no monastery ever confirmed his arrival. No one followed up. Years later, the room he lived in was repainted and reassigned to a younger priest who resigned 2 weeks later without explanation. He left behind no letter, just a burned fragment of parchment discovered in the fireplace ash. A Latin phrase partially intact, "Per campanam qui audierit," he who hears through the bell. But even more chilling than the silence was what came after. 1 week following Benedict's disappearance, a new name appeared on the clergy rotation. A man from Oxford, hand-picked by the church's psychological commission. Quiet. Studious. Invited, not by request, but by subtle necessity. He was to investigate spiritual fatigue among the clergy. His name, Father Llewellyn Ashcroft. And the first thing he did upon arrival was ask for the key to Father Benedict's quarters. Not to enter, but to keep it. He said the room must remain sealed until it stopped whispering. Father Llewellyn Ashcroft arrived at St. Paul's on a gray afternoon, rain falling in a dull, rhythmless pattern against the cathedral windows, as though the sky itself had forgotten how to grieve. His arrival drew little notice. He wore no ornate robes, bore no airs of academic pride, and traveled with nothing more than a leather satchel and a thin rectangular box strapped shut with black ribbon. The box never left his possession. He introduced himself as a simple assistant chaplain on temporary placement, though the senior clergy had already been briefed behind closed doors. Ashcroft was not there to preach. He had been appointed under quiet directives from the church's internal bureau, a group known only to those who were expected to never name it. Their concern was rising patterns among the clergy. Sleepwalking, erratic sermons, gaps in memory, and in some cases, speech paralysis. The symptoms were dismissed publicly as spiritual fatigue. Privately, they were classified under one term: contamination of confession. Ashcroft had studied theology at Oxford, but took his greatest interest in the experimental sciences that bloomed beneath it: early neurology, the newly emerging field of electrical medicine, and theories about the physical weight of guilt. While his peers chased the salvation of souls, Ashcroft wondered what made a soul sick to begin with. He was fascinated by how trauma distorted perception and how the brain responded to ritual. He kept clippings from asylum casebooks, made sketches of patients under trance states, and believed that the ritual repetition of sin might leave residue, not only on the conscience but physically, neurologically, like soot in the folds of the brain. He called this resonant guilt, and he came to St. Paul's not to study priests but to locate what he believed was a spiritual transmitter hiding within their routines. Something embedded, not spoken, not seen, but echoed. From his first night, Ashcroft kept meticulous notes. He never spoke during meals. He watched the priests more than he spoke to them. He walked the cathedral halls at midnight with no candle, memorizing each creak of the floorboards, each gust that passed through the arches. He believed churches were like instruments, capable of playing tones no human voice could imitate. He called it infrasacral frequency and claimed it was strongest beneath confessionals. In his second week, he began charting the blood pressure and pupil response of priests after Mass. He would ask them routine questions, but record their answers against breath intervals and micro-tremors in his hands. The priests, though wary, complied. His tone was soft, almost apologetic. His face was without judgment, but there was something in his eyes that didn't blink often enough. What no one saw was what he kept in the rectangular box. Locked behind the cabinet of his quarters was a hand-wired EEG monitor, an experimental device designed to measure electrical pulses in the scalp. He used it late at night on himself, applying wet cloth electrodes while reciting specific verses backward, then mapping his brain's response. He recorded patterns when the final bell failed to ring. He noted a sharp spike in alpha rhythm each time he passed through the nave after dusk. He believed something was being projected, not just symbolically, but psychically, through the very architecture of St. Paul's. To most, Ashcroft seemed calm, if not distant. But inside, he was growing more certain that the church had been built on a design older than Scripture, one that mirrored not heaven but something underneath it. He became fixated on confession booths, often sitting alone in them for hours with the door closed, measuring sound leaks, tapping on the walls, whispering verses under his breath and recording what came back. Once he claimed to have heard a pulse, rhythmic and low, beneath the wooden floor. Not footsteps, not wind, a pulse. He began calling it the voice under the veil. Weeks passed. Another priest disappeared. Ashcroft said nothing. Instead, he marked a small X in the corner of his notes and wrote only one sentence. The guilt has shape. Beneath the vestry of St. Paul's, behind a stone panel no one had touched in centuries, Father Ashcroft oversaw the quiet construction of a chamber that did not appear on any blueprint. He had paid a deaf stonemason, smuggled in from Liverpool, and dismissed him after 3 nights. No one else ever saw the full space completed. It was not large, no more than 12 feet across, but it was precise. Every surface was tiled in slate and polished metal, angled to disorient the eye. There were no crucifixes, no icons, no altar. It was a sanctum of reflection, not reverence. Ashcroft named it the Reflection Ward, but privately he called it the Listening Room, a space built not to contain silence but to amplify what lived underneath it. At the center of the room sat the device, a steel-framed upright chair, rigid and cold with 6 mirrored panels bolted around its arms, shoulders, and back, forcing whoever sat upon it to confront their own image from every angle. Ashcroft designed it after months of sketching and revision. He believed that sin multiplied when unspoken but decayed when reflected. The mirrors weren't just for humiliation. He claimed they caused a specific neurochemical reaction, a collapse between self-image and internal guilt, triggering what he termed cognitive inversion. But the mirrors were only the first layer. Beneath the chair was a coiled copper pipe connected to a small crucible chamber. Ashcroft filled it with cinnabar ore, extracted from an apothecary supplier under a false name. When heated, it released low doses of mercury vapor, enough to distort vision, slow the tongue, and loosen inhibition without causing immediate collapse. The subject would not know they were breathing it. They would simply begin to feel watched from within. Ashcroft's sessions were unannounced. The priests he selected were not told why they had been summoned. He would knock once on their door near midnight, offer a soft word about their spiritual fatigue, and walk them silently to the lower vestry. Most followed him without resistance. They trusted him, not because he was warm, but because he was clinical. His calmness made fear feel unreasonable. They assumed they were being examined for burnout or depression. They had no idea they were walking into a machine built to extract truth from the soul like pus from an infected wound. Once seated, they were asked only one question. What truth do you fear to confess? Ashcroft never repeated it. He simply sat across from them, notebook in hand, and waited. The mercury would begin to haze the air after 5 minutes. The mirrors would catch the flickering gaslight and bend it into a blur. And slowly the priests would speak, not always in full sentences, sometimes in murmurs, sometimes in tears, sometimes in tongues. One confessed to watching a child drown and calling it fate. Another admitted he had stopped believing in God 12 years ago but continued his duties because he feared poverty. One screamed for 7 minutes and clawed his own face, insisting that someone inside the chair was whispering back. Ashcroft did not interrupt. He only recorded. He wrote in symbols and abbreviations, developing a private shorthand for common themes. Guilt of neglect, fear of judgment, repressed desire. But what fascinated him most were the patterns that crossed cases. Descriptions of a second presence, the mention of a bell tone that spoke without sound, and repeated references to something underneath the cathedral. When 2 different priests uttered the same phrase, "The floor hums with memory," Ashcroft circled the line so hard the pen tore the page. After each session, the priests were released. They never returned of their own will. Ashcroft never summoned them twice. Some were transferred shortly after, sent to rural parishes or retirement homes without formal request. Others stayed and gradually withdrew from daily duties, becoming shadows among the clergy. One went blind within a week. Another began scratching mirrors until his knuckles bled. Their silence was taken as humility. Their deterioration is mistaken for spiritual burden. The church noticed the changes but did not interfere. They assumed Ashcroft's methods, though unorthodox, were producing results. Fewer priests were speaking of fatigue. Attendance held steady. The vestry remained quiet, and the bell at the end of Mass still did not ring. Father Lionel Willoughby was not a man prone to outbursts. He had always spoken gently, his voice smooth and distant like rain against stained glass. Parishioners described him as graceful, almost ghost-like, never hurried, never harsh. His hands moved with the caution of someone afraid to break what he touched. But something inside him had shifted after the disappearance of Father Benedict. Willoughby began walking alone at night, often up and down the spiral stairs of the bell tower. Some said he was praying, others said he was counting. By the second week of Ashcroft's arrival, Willoughby was seen less often in the chapel and more frequently staring into the corners of the cathedral where no icon hung, no candle was lit. He claimed the air in those places felt thinner, almost hollow. That the cathedral was less a house of God and more a throat, and it was beginning to hum. The night before he died, Willoughby asked the bellkeeper if the old tower mechanism still worked. The man said it did, but the final bell had been decommissioned due to vibrational anomalies. Willoughby nodded once and said nothing else. He then returned to his quarters and rewrote his entire sermon by candlelight. Every line had been blacked out but one, a psalm about the Lord's voice shaking the wilderness. That page was later found folded neatly beneath his mattress alongside a mirror broken in 5 perfect pieces. They found him the next morning, posed upright in the southern bell tower alcove, balanced on the rail that overlooked the nave. His arms were outstretched as if mid-sermon. His robes had been tied to the iron rods behind him in such a way that he could not fall. His mouth was slightly open, teeth bared, and his eyes were gone. Not ripped, not gouged, but surgically removed, clean and precise, without splatter. Where his eyes had been, wax had been poured, sealing the socket smooth and white. A note had been pinned beneath his collar using a thin sewing needle. It was written on the back of a communion card. The message was simple. He showed me. Ashcroft was the first to arrive at the scene. He asked no one to move the body. Instead, he instructed the bellkeeper to ring the first bell, then the second. But not the last. Never the last. He recorded the scene in his notebook with mechanical detachment, sketching the angles of Willoughby's arms and making a note of the position of the feet, which had been scrubbed clean. When the bishop was informed, Ashcroft presented the theory of suicide, a tragic mental break exacerbated by recent disappearances. He emphasized Willoughby's growing instability, the mirror fragments, the rewritten sermon. He suggested the eyes were a symbolic act of blindness to earthly distraction. The bishop, shaken and reluctant, agreed. No inquest was held. The funeral never came. The body was cremated before sundown, reportedly at Ashcroft's urging to prevent spiritual contamination. The ashes were kept in a sealed urn, but no one ever claimed them. The pulpit where Willoughby last stood was scrubbed twice, and yet some claimed it still smelled faintly of beeswax and copper. From that night forward, several of the younger priests began sleeping with candles burning by their doors. Others reported hearing faint footsteps pacing the nave between 2 and 4 in the morning. When they went to check, the doors were locked, the halls were empty. But always, in the stillness that followed, they claimed to hear something just beneath silence, a low, rhythmic tone. Not a voice, not a song, a pattern, as if something had been released and now wandered freely through the bones of the cathedral. And Ashcroft, ever quiet, began wearing white gloves at all times, even when alone. Father Ashcroft's journal was never meant to be read. It wasn't hidden in a drawer or tucked beneath a mattress like the others. It was sewn, carefully, deliberately, into the lining of his vestments pressed against his spine where no one would think to search. Pages of ragged parchment bound with black thread and written in 3 languages, English, Latin, and anatomical shorthand, each entry more exacting than the last. What he recorded there was not spiritual, it was surgical, and it revealed a truth far more grotesque than madness. Ashcroft did not believe the soul was metaphysical. He believed it was measurable, a construct of memory, trauma, and repetition that could be touched, mapped, and manipulated. He called his work neuropurgation, the deliberate exposure of the inner self to unfiltered truth, through sensory collapse and targeted neural stimulation. It began subtly. Ashcroft removed the cushions from confessionals and replaced them with narrow wood benches. He widened the kneeler angles to induce pressure on the sciatic nerve, then observed how long it took for the priest to shift position during confession. He watched for eye dilation, sweat patterns, involuntary blinking. These were his metrics of guilt. But observation was not enough. He wanted a reaction. And so, in the chamber beneath the vestry, where the penance bench sat surrounded by polished mirrors and sweet, slow mercury, he began a new phase of experimentation. He used long, sterilized surgical needles, imported discreetly in hollowed-out candle boxes. Each was marked for depth and curve. He inserted them at specific cranial points behind the ear, near the temple, along the jaw. Places where guilt lived silently in the flesh, he believed. Each insertion was followed by scripture, recited in a calm monotone, not for prayer, for conditioning. The pain was not the punishment. It was the instrument by which clarity could be summoned. Priests were selected based on their verbal hesitations, micro-confessions, and dreams reported through the confessional booth. They were brought in during full darkness, blindfolded. The chamber had no clock, no candle, no sense of time. Some were kept for hours, others for days. They were not told what was happening. Ashcroft would begin with questions, not about sin, but about fear. What image haunts you most when you close your eyes? When did you first know you were not clean? Their answers were recorded phonetically, even the stutters, even the gasps. As the mercury accumulated in the chamber and the nerves were stimulated in sequence, many began to hallucinate. Some claimed they were sinking into the floor. Others swore their bodies had become translucent, that their blood sang hymns they'd never learned. One priest insisted that his lungs had filled with black feathers and that every breath was a crow clawing to escape. Not all broke the same way. Some emerged catatonic, unable to blink, staring past the world. Others sobbed and kissed Ashcroft's hands, thanking him for revealing what God could not. But the most disturbing were the euphoric ones, the priests who came back smiling, blind, burned at the temples where the needles had gone too deep. They said they had been emptied. They said the burden was gone. One whispered that he had seen the soul, and it was shaped like a cage with no door. That man was later found in the chapel licking the marble floor in slow circles, humming a tune that did not match any recorded hymn. Ashcroft wrote of these results clinically. He was not cruel. He saw himself as a purifier, not a punisher. The church had failed, he believed, because it forgave too easily. He wanted something deeper, not penance but exposure. A system to render the internal visible. He began sketching diagrams of the guilt cluster, a supposed tangle of neural tissue just beneath the thalamus where shame, memory, and unresolved sin converged. His theory was that if the soul had weight, it could be drained, not killed, but reduced, like bleeding a fever. He made plans to remove the cluster from a subject, though no one knows if he ever succeeded. The priests who survived never spoke again of what happened beneath the vestry. Some retired early, some disappeared. A few remained, changed, quieter, obedient in a way that seemed less holy than vacant. They moved through the cathedral like they were already underground, and Ashcroft, now wearing heavier robes to conceal new instruments stitched into the lining, began preparations for a more permanent form of confession, one that could not be reversed. Joseph Marsh had worked beneath the cathedral for over 20 years. He was not clergy, nor scholar, nor steward of any divine office. He was a candle maker, a man whose trade was quiet, solitary, and deeply trusted. Each candle used during Mass had passed through his hands. He mixed the wax, cut the wicks, measured the taper, and infused each with a drop of blessed oil before placing them into carved boxes marked for their place on the altar. His work was sacred in its own way, unnoticed, unpraised, but essential. And because no one paid him much attention, Joseph saw things others didn't. He noticed, for example, when the wax orders tripled in size despite no increase in attendance. He noticed that certain boxes were labeled with initials he didn't recognize, and he noticed the requests shifting away from ceremonial sizes towards something more surgical. Shorter lengths, thicker diameters. Orders for beeswax sheets, not candles, and spools of cotton wick knotted every 2 inches. Nothing used for light, nothing that belonged on a pulpit. At first, he told himself it was administrative confusion. The church was always reorganizing things. But then came the nights when the air changed. Some evenings, long after the vesper bell, Joseph would still be down in the wax room when a strange sweetness would fill the corridor. Not incense, but something denser, chemical, like resin mixed with burnt sugar. He followed the scent once, only once. It led him past the crypt stairs, toward a corridor he had never noticed in all his years there. The stonework was different, older, rougher, and lined with a thin trail of wax droplets spaced perfectly apart, like something had been carried through while still soft. He followed that trail through a half-open wooden door he didn't remember ever seeing. Behind it, the smell grew sharper, almost metallic. Then he saw the light. Inside the subchapel, lit only by the glow of slow-burning wax, stood a silver table too clean to be for communion. On it, a priest lay strapped and semi-conscious, mouth sealed shut with layers of beeswax pressed flat over the lips. The wax had been carved with markings, symbols Joseph did not recognize, some angular, some curved like broken music notes. Father Ashcroft stood above him, dressed in full cassock, his gloved hands holding a long metal instrument that glinted like a scalpel, but ended in a tuning fork. As he pressed it against the priest's sternum, he whispered a word and struck the fork. A sound filled the air, low, hollow, like the sound a tomb might make if it sighed. The priest twitched but did not scream. The wax held. Ashcroft leaned close, his mouth at the priest's ear, and began speaking so softly that the words melted into breath. Joseph didn't move. He couldn't. He had stepped backward once, and the floor beneath him had made a sound. Ashcroft looked up, not startled, not afraid, just aware. Their eyes met. Joseph turned and ran. The next morning, the candle order logs were gone. His wax room was emptied. The only thing left on his bench was a single beeswax taper, unburned, with a short black wick curled like a question mark. Joseph Marsh did not return home that night. His neighbors assumed he was ill. The church made no announcement. A replacement was hired within a week, but some evenings a faint dripping sound could be heard behind the walls near the sub-chapel. And once, long after midnight, a parish boy cleaning the vestibule found a small handprint pressed into the melted wax pooling beneath the apse. The print was shallow, and it smelled faintly of blood and lavender. Father Ashcroft, when asked casually about Marsh's absence, only smiled. He said wax is like a memory. If you press into it hard enough, it holds the shape forever. Beneath the crypt, deeper than any funeral rite had ever dared descend, there was a second chamber that did not appear on cathedral maps. It had no staircase, no public entry, and no name spoken aloud. Only Ashcroft knew how to access it. The entrance had once been sealed with mortar and forgotten during the restoration after the Great Fire. It had originally been a plague tomb, a place where the dead were stacked without ceremony, their names never written, their sins never confessed. Ashcroft had found it by accident, or so he claimed in his journal, though those who later read his entries suspected he had been searching for it all along. He called it Sanctum Viscera, the sacred place of nerves. But to those who entered it, it was not sacred. It was starvation disguised as clarity, and it was never meant to be escaped. Ashcroft repurposed the tomb into a neurological sanctum. The stone walls were covered in a thin layer of crushed oyster shell and lime, creating a surface that shimmered faintly in the dark. The floor was tiled with Latin scripture, but every word was reversed as if meant to be read not with the eyes but with the mind turned inside out. Each tile had been set by hand, each one placed after hours. The air was cold, permanently damp, and carried a strange static like the silence before a storm. He believed the tomb's former purpose, a place of hurried death and unconfessed sin, left an energetic imprint. That the suffering of the plague victims had never truly left, only sunk into the walls, becoming fuel for something deeper than ritual. Inside the chamber, Ashcroft constructed 3 isolation cells. Each was small enough that a man could neither stand fully nor lie down flat. There was no light, no sound, and no concept of time. Priests placed inside were not told how long they would remain. They were simply led down, blindfolded, with the faint promise that this was a place for silence to speak. What happened next varied. Some wept uncontrollably within hours. Others laughed for no reason and spoke in fragments of childhood prayers. Many emerged unable to name the days of the week. A few began whispering to people who were not present, convinced they were surrounded. Ashcroft referred to these symptoms as alignment, the moment when the ego fractured and the soul began to reorient toward what he believed was absolute memory. The self stripped of narrative. One priest lasted 6 days. When finally pulled from the chamber, his nails had been bitten down to the bone. He had scratched the tile around him until his fingers bled. He spoke only once more in his life. The sentence was recorded by a nurse at the sanitarium where he was later committed. It was this: "The words are backward because they were meant for him, not us." From then on, he sang only psalms in reverse. No one could stop him. He died in silence 5 years later after biting through his own tongue. Ashcroft recorded every trial. He called the chambers mirrors without reflection. He believed that true revelation occurred only after sense had been denied. Vision, language, time, each was a mask the soul wore to remain sane. Strip them away and you did not find madness, you found clarity. His final test was to leave a priest inside the sanctum with a mirror etched in reversed scripture, mounted above the wall where the plague bodies had once been stacked. The priest was instructed to stare at the mirror until he saw his own father's face. It took 3 days. When the door opened, the priest was grinning. His pupils were blown wide, his heart rate dangerously slow. He said only this: "My father forgave me, but God won't." Then he collapsed. The church never knew of the sanctum, or perhaps it did and chose to forget. When renovation work began decades later, workers sealed it in concrete without ceremony. No markings, no plaque. Just the sound of wet cement covering the floor where once every whisper had echoed backward. Ashcroft, meanwhile, began preparing for something else, something that could not be built in stone, but only in sound. There was a confessional booth near the north transept that priests began to avoid. Not openly, never with words, but in subtle ways. Missed schedules, forgotten keys, quietly shuffled duty rosters. It looked no different from the others. Dark wood, modest crucifix, velvet curtains worn thin from decades of sorrow. But those who entered it left differently. They walked slower, as if their thoughts had been bound tighter than before. Some pressed their fingers against their ears afterward, as though something inside had made a sound they couldn't forget. The booth had no official name, but Ashcroft referred to it in his journal as Vox Orbis, the voice of the world. Inside the kneeler, hidden beneath the wooden panel that once held prayer cards, Ashcroft had installed a pressure-triggered phonograph mechanism. It was custom-made, built with delicate copper tubing and modified gears sourced from a watchmaker who believed he was building a musical clock for a children's asylum. When someone knelt with enough weight, the mechanism engaged, silently, invisibly, and began to record. But it was not calibrated to capture speech. Ashcroft had tuned the diaphragm to ignore structured vocal tone. It responded only to a specific frequency range, the irregular tremor of weeping. He believed words could be rehearsed, but tears could not. Tears were the soul's unfiltered voice, an involuntary confession, immune to pride or shame. He called this process emotive imprinting, and it became his obsession. Dozens of priests over the course of weeks unknowingly wept into the machine. Some cried quietly, barely audible. Others broke suddenly, triggered by guilt, memory, or something far less nameable. What none of them realized was that their pain was being captured, not to be studied, but to be repurposed. Ashcroft would retrieve the wax cylinders in the dead of night, slip them into his vestment sleeves, and carry them back to his chamber beneath the vestry. There, by candlelight, he played each one back, listening not for what was said, but for rhythm, breath, and resonance. He catalogued them by tone, pleading, regretful, stunned. He began to layer them, splice them together. He found patterns in the pauses between sobs, in the hitch of breath between phrases. Then slowly, he began to shape them into a hymn. The process took months. When completed, the result was not music in any traditional sense. It was a haunting progression of sound. Sorrow strung into melody, fear stretched into harmony, layered with such precision that it felt like a liturgical chant unraveling at the seams. He called it Missa Lacrimarum, the Mass of Tears. He wired it into the cathedral's organ using a series of hidden copper tubes, threading it through the frame like a second voice waiting to emerge. And during early morning hours, when the nave was empty and the light had not yet reached the stained glass, Ashcroft would activate it, flooding the cathedral with the hidden sorrow of its priests, disguised as sacred music. From the pulpit, it sounded like mourning. From the pews, it sounded holy. No one knew what they were hearing. Some said the music made them feel lighter. Others left Mass unable to speak for hours. A young altar boy was found rocking back and forth after rehearsal one day, mouthing a phrase that made no sense. I heard it breathing. He was sent home and never returned. The church praised Ashcroft for bringing solemnity back to service. Attendance rose, donations followed. But the priests stopped weeping, or perhaps they had simply run out of tears. In the booth, the phonograph no longer triggered. The recordings fell silent. Ashcroft noted this change carefully. He wrote, "They no longer cry. Either they are healed or they have become hollow. Both are acceptable." And beneath the organ, sealed in a locked box, sat the final cylinder, untouched, unmarked, which he reserved for himself. By the time Bishop Alderton arrived at St. Paul's, The cathedral had become quieter than ever, not peaceful, silent in a way that pressed on the chest as if the very walls were waiting. Rumors had reached the diocese in hushed fragments, vanishing priests, erratic hymns, whispered reports of blind confessions and empty rooms. The bishop had not planned his visit. He arrived unannounced, escorted by 2 administrative aides and an archivist from Canterbury. No trumpets, no clergy greeting at the door. Just the echo of their shoes across the flagstone floor. The nave was empty. The air tasted like metal. They found Ashcroft in the sacristy waiting as if he'd known the hour of their arrival. He stood facing the great crucifix, head bowed, hands folded neatly over his chest. But something was wrong. His robes hung strangely, layered, heavy, thick as winter cloth. When he turned, the aide stepped back involuntarily. It wasn't one robe, it was 15. Each belonged to a missing priest. Their names had been stitched into the inner collars by hand. Ashcroft had sewn them together into one monstrous garment. The seams were not even. The cloth twisted. Some still bore faint wax stains, others the crust of dried incense ash. On top of this layered vestment, he had arranged every lost stole, every cord, every symbol of authority he had quietly taken from the bodies now gone. His face was calm. His voice was steady. He told the bishop that there had been no deaths, only ascensions. As Ashcroft approached, Bishop Alderton noticed something moving beneath the collar. Not cloth, skin. Pale pink skin covered in jagged red lines that at first appeared like scratches. But they were words. His body from clavicle to navel had been tattooed with scripture, not by ink but by carving. The lines were deep and fresh. The blood had been sealed with wax. Each passage was written in a different hand. Later, investigators would confirm the handwriting matched that of the 15 missing priests. Ashcroft had written their final verses into his flesh, not as homage, as housing. The bishop opened his mouth, but no words came. His lips twitched, his eyes widened. Then he collapsed. The aides rushed to him, but it was already too late. He had suffered a cerebral stroke on the spot. Whether it was the sight of Ashcroft or something else he saw, something just beyond what others could see, would never be known. The bishop was buried quietly, his death ruled as natural. The church made no mention of his final assignment. Ashcroft offered no resistance. When church officials returned that evening, they found him seated calmly in the pew where Father Benedict once used to kneel. He held a small silver box in his lap. Inside were shavings of bone and 3 small vials of wax labeled vision, sound, and nerve. He surrendered the box willingly. He asked only that his room remain locked for 40 days. No one honored that request. His quarters revealed everything and nothing. Notebooks filled with diagrams of human skulls overlaid with confessional architecture. Wax molds of lips sealed mid-prayer. Mirrors inscribed with backward scripture, and a final page that simply read, "I am the vessel." The others were flames. The church acted swiftly. Ashcroft was declared psychologically unfit and removed under a veil of administrative secrecy. He was transferred to St. Verena's Asylum, a facility for clergy suffering from what was politely termed sacramental fracture. There was no trial, no confession, no headline, only a single line in the diocesan archive. Father Llewellyn Ashcroft removed from active ministry due to canonical exhaustion. At St. Verena's, he was placed in the blind ward, a wing reserved for those whose behavior triggered unexplained visual episodes in other patients. His room was reinforced with soundproof brick, and his mouth was stitched with surgical thread for the first 10 days until he promised to remain silent. He never spoke again, but he never stopped writing. Every morning, nurses would find new diagrams carved into the wooden frame of his bed, Lines, arches, and chamber patterns that resembled cathedrals built for something with no eyes and no need for light. And so, the quiet man who once studied the shape of guilt became an echo beneath stone, buried alive in the very silence he had helped create. St. Verena's asylum sat at the edge of the woods like something that had been buried and forgotten by accident. It was not a place people visited. It was a place people were placed. The records say Ashcroft arrived quietly under heavy cloth, escorted by two silent men in clerical black. He was not shackled. He walked on his own. His eyes remained downcast and his hands were folded as if still at prayer. But even in that early moment, the staff noted something peculiar. The birds near the ward window stopped chirping when he passed. Not suddenly, not startled. They simply ceased, as if interrupted by a presence they couldn't name. He was placed in the blind ward, a restricted section meant for clergy who exhibited severe sensory distortions or caused them in others. It was the only ward with no mirrors and no access to printed scripture. Within the first week, 3 orderlies requested transfer. One had begun hearing organ music during sleep hours. Another claimed that Ashcroft's silence felt louder than speech, that it pressed on the skull like a headache just before rain. Ashcroft spoke to no one, but he wrote. Every night he etched the end of a snapped spoon into the wooden frame of his cot. Not letters, not words, lines, arcs, vaults, spiral angles that at first seemed architectural, until someone realized they matched no known section of St. Verena's. They matched St. Paul's, not as it existed, but as something deeper, hidden, shaped like a maze beneath a sermon. The drawings became more detailed. He scratched out diagrams that included chambers no one had ever seen, staircases that curved into themselves, and phrases like echo artery and sacristy beneath the veil. These terms meant nothing to the staff, but one former deacon, brought in to observe, turned pale and left mid-visit. He later told a colleague that the sketches resembled the unfinished notes of a Vatican architect who vanished in 1749 while designing subterranean chapels intended for inhuman echoes. Ashcroft ate little, slept less. He stared at the corners of his cell as if waiting for something to appear. The patients who shared his space fared worse. Some reported waking with unfamiliar hymns carved into their skin. Shallow etchings on the thighs or across the ribcage, the cuts straight and neat, as if made by something guided. The asylum nurse tried covering Ashcroft's fingernails with cloth. The carvings continued. One patient refused to sleep, insisting that the floor beneath his cot pulsed. Another claimed he heard confession through the walls at night, though no priests had visited in months. Eventually, Ashcroft was moved to his own cell. The decision was made after a patient began choking during morning inspection and was found with a wax plug deep inside his throat. No wax had ever been stored in the ward. Ashcroft never acknowledged the others. His work became quieter, slower, more deliberate. On his final night, he used his own blood to sketch a new diagram. Not of the cathedral, but of the human skull. He mapped its chambers like a chapel, naming parts of the brain as if they were sacred spaces. The nave of memory, the cloister of doubt, the vestry of shame. He titled the drawing Domus Interioris, the house within. The staff found him seated upright against the far wall, his body cold, his eyes open. There were no signs of violence, no signs of peace. The ward was sealed the next day, the bed was burned, the walls were bricked over without ceremony. No one was told why. The church never claimed the body, no mass was held. His name was quietly removed from the records, but the cell remains untouched behind a layer of stone, sealed beneath years of dust. And sometimes, at the far end of St. Verena's, when all the lights are off and the corridors breathe, staff say they can still hear a voice, not speaking, not singing, just humming. Soft, repetitive, like the closing bars of a hymn that no one remembers learning. Years passed. The world outside St. Paul's Cathedral continued to spin in its predictable cycles of war, peace, growth, and decay, and yet within the hallowed stone walls, something lingered. It was as though the cathedral had absorbed the weight of its own secrets and now kept them, buried beneath its sacred veneer, like shadows in the corners of a room too long left undisturbed. Ashcroft's name, once whispered with trepidation, had faded into nothing. The church was far too adept at hiding uncomfortable truths, far too practiced in erasing the past with subtlety and silence. But beneath the polished floors, behind gilded doors and beyond the stained glass windows, his legacy endured, even if it was never spoken aloud. It was an independent inquiry decades later that stumbled upon the truth. A young archivist, underwhelmed by his mundane duties of cataloging forgotten relics, came across a mislabeled box one autumn morning, a box that had somehow escaped the normal rigors of inspection. Inside there were journals, architectural blueprints, and handwritten recordings that had been marked with Ashcroft's name. The first pages were benign enough: theological notes on the structure of confession, drafts for potential sermons, sketches of the cathedral's more decorative elements. But as the archivist dug deeper, the tone shifted. Diagrams appeared. Strange, layered maps of St. Paul's that included hidden corridors, forgotten chambers, and strange chambers that had never been built. Then came the detailed recordings, the sound of the cathedral's organ, strange melodies that echoed not from a human hand, but from something else, something buried deep beneath the altar itself. His notes spoke of experiments, of sound waves and frequencies, of manipulating the human mind through ritual and exposure to raw, untamed fear. The blood-stained journals detailed a methodical obsession to break the boundaries between physical and spiritual worlds. Ashcroft had not just left an imprint on the church, he had woven himself into its very structure. The Vatican was immediately alerted. The church, ever quick to cover its missteps, attempted to contain the discovery, but the press, once the information began leaking, seized upon the story like a wildfire. Rumors spread that Ashcroft had not only been a madman but had used the cathedral itself as an instrument of psychological manipulation, turning confession into an unholy art. The blueprints included plans for tunnels and sound chambers hidden beneath the altar, a method of creating infrasound to manipulate the subconscious of anyone who entered. Ashcroft's journals hinted at using guilt as a weapon, that the soul's corruption could be extracted by exposure to raw, unprocessed truth. His experiments, carried out in secret, had begun with the priests but had expanded to the faithful, the cathedral itself turning into a vast instrument of both faith and torment. But despite the growing pressure for a public trial, the Vatican remained silent. No official statement was issued, and no one ever stood before the courts to account for the horrors Ashcroft had orchestrated. There was no trial, no reckoning. Instead, the church did what it always did. It buried the truth deeper. Ashcroft's records were sealed, his experiments dismissed as the work of a delusional mind, and any public investigation was quietly extinguished. The file was misfiled, mislabeled, forgotten. It became just another whisper in the cathedral's many dark corners. Those who dug deeper into the mystery often came away hollowed, their minds splintered by the secrets they uncovered. And those who had once whispered Ashcroft's name now kept silent, knowing what they had found was a story best left untold. And so, years after the secrets had been buried, the only remnant of Ashcroft's work was a small, inconspicuous plaque near the rear chapel of St. Paul's. It read, "To those who served beyond the veil, no names, no mention of the lives lost, the minds fractured, or the horrors that had taken place beneath the altar. No one dared speak of the truth that remained hidden beneath the weight of tradition and the fragile veneer of faith. It was a memorial that gave no answers, only more questions, and in the end, that silence became the most haunting thing of all. The cathedral's bells rang each morning, their sound thick with the years of faith and sacrifice, but no one truly listened anymore.